Research Talk. In our previous videos, we talked about different coding strategies. And all those coding strategies that we talked about, whether descriptive coding, process coding, in vivo coding, concept coding. We also talked about some supplemental method of coding such as emotion coding, versus coding, value coding, and you may have experienced up to now that all these coding approaches that we discussed, they were all based emerges from the data. So we'll look at the transcript, we'll look at the excerpt, and then we generate code from those excerpts. So we can look at one sentence, one small paragraph, and then we code that. And these codes are emerging, coming out of the data that we are coding. So that coding approach is very, we call it exploratory coding style. Exploratory because the codes are not predetermined. The codes emerges from the data. There is another style of coding, another method of coding where we reverse this process. So unlike the exploratory strategies where the codes are emerging from the data, we use another method called protocol coding. In protocol coding, we first develop a coding framework. What is a coding framework? We decide what are the codes we want to use in advance. So before we start coding the data, interview transcript or observation data or any kind of, let's say, document related data, before we start coding, we have already decided codes for what we are looking for. And then we start coding. So to do that, you first develop a coding framework. What is a coding framework? Based on your research topic, you come up with codes. And so let's say a coding framework could be like, let's say if I'm exploring, I'm just taking a hypothetical example. Let's say I'm exploring empathy. So my coding framework could be code 1, code 2, code 3, and then maybe code 1 might have another subcode, subcode 1, subcode 2, and subcode 3. And similarly, other codes might also have some subcodes. So this is my coding framework. So I'm using this coding framework. I look at the transcript and then I use these codes. I read the excerpt and I ask myself, which code fits in this excerpt? Out of this coding framework, what code really explain what this person is talking here? And then I use these pre-established codes. So a very important thing to keep in mind about protocol coding is the codes are pre-established. So these codes are pre-decided. You develop a coding framework and you use these pre-decided codes to code your data, and that's protocol coding. So in protocol coding, how you develop your coding framework? What approach? Because you cannot just come up with some codes and say, hey, this is what I'm gonna code. This is my coding framework. No, a coding framework needs to be have some empirical base. It needs to be like, it needs to have some empirical evidence why and how these codes are important to capture this particular phenomenon or experience. So it has to be empirically, it has to have some research base. So when you develop a coding framework, it has to be empirically based. And what it means that maybe you could use a theory, a pre-established theory, or maybe a theoretical framework or conceptual framework. You can use literature review like the prior study does, which are already been done, and based on those literature review, maybe some theory in your field, or maybe a conceptual framework, you establish these framework, your coding framework. And when you code your data, we use these codes which fits into the excerpt that you are coding. So you see, protocol coding is a strategy where the codes are already developed based on literature, based on some theory, based on some framework, and it has an empirical evidence. And based on those evidence, you develop your coding framework. And coding framework include all the codes that you want to use while coding the data. And then you use those codes while coding your data. Let me use my computer to give an example of how protocol coding looks like. So on my screen, you could see now, this is a study on experiences of domestic violence against women. And as I said, in protocol coding, the researcher develop their coding framework very much in advance before they start coding the data. And so here is a coding framework developed to study this phenomenon. And you could see, so experiences of domestic violence against women. And here is the coding framework, types of abuse. So 3 types of abuse: verbal abuse, physical abuse, threats of violence. And then the second code has is barrier to seeking help. And you could see there are 3 codes: fear of retaliation, lack of safe housing options, and social stigma. And then you have support services, which is access to shelters, availability of resources such as counseling, legal assistance, perception of support from service providers. And we got another code, which is social attitudes and perceptions, and it has some sub codes, which is stigma surrounding domestic violence, victim blaming attitudes, and awareness and educational levels. And further, survivor coping mechanism, which includes safety planning, emotional coping strategies, and seeking support from family and friends. And finally, societal response, which is advocacy efforts, need to increase awareness and education, and importance of societal support for survivors. So you see, the researcher has already developed a coding framework, and these are the codes and subcodes. Now, these codes are developed not out of figment of imagination of the researcher. It is done based on prior studies, literature done on this topic of violence against women, and maybe some theories or framework which is already developed by other researcher to explore this phenomenon. So this coding framework is developed. We will use this coding framework to code the transcript here. So here is the transcript, you could see, and we will use this coding framework to code the transcript. That's what happens in protocol coding strategy. So let's begin. Interviewer, thank you for agreeing to participate in this research interview. To start, could you please tell me about your experiences or observations regarding domestic violence against women? So we will not quote that because it's the excerpt from the interviewer. Now the participant is responding, sure. I've actually had some personal experience with this issue. My sister was in an abusive relationship for several years, and it was really difficult for our family to deal with. So this person is talking about her sister and how she was in an abusive relationship. So let's keep going. Interviewer, I'm sorry to hear that. Can you describe what the abusive behavior looked like in her relationship? So now going deeper into the abuse. The first excerpt is more like identifying where it happened. It happened in relatives, in this case sisters, in an abusive relationship. Participant, it started off with verbal insults and put downs, but it escalated over time to physical violence. He could hit her, push her, and even threaten her with weapons sometimes. So now, if you look at the coding framework, let's go back here. So type of abuse, and this person is saying that started with with verbal, and then escalated to physical and threats of violence. So all these three codes which describe the type of abuse is applying there. So let's put these codes here under this excerpt. So verbal abuse, physical abuse, and threats of violence. All right. So what we are doing, we are not generating a separate code here. What we are doing, based on the excerpt, based on what is shared here, we are coding the data, and we are asking ourselves what code matches the excerpt that we are reading here. So these three codes matches the excerpt here, and we code it there. Let's keep moving. Interviewer, that sounds terrifying. How did your sister cope with the situation? Participant, she was really scared and felt trapped for a long time. She didn't want to leave because she was worried about what he might do if she tried to leave. Eventually, though, she reached out to a domestic violence shelter for help, and they provided her with resources to leave safely. So she here, the participant is talking about that why she was not leaving that abusive relationship, because she was just scared that this person would hurt her. So that was, so if we go back to our coding manual, so the barrier to seeking help, which is fear of retaliation, I think this code applies there, because she didn't leave that for some time because she was scared of this person might hurt her in retaliation if she does so. So let's code it here. Fear of retaliation. Also, in the later paragraph, she is saying, eventually, though, she reached out to a domestic violence shelter for help, and they provided her with resources. So you see here in our code book, is access to shelters, which is like the support services. So this person got in touch with these support services. They provide shelters and guidance to survivor of domestic violence. So access to shelter also fits in here. Let's keep moving. Interviewer, it is commendable that she sought help. Did she face any challenges in accessing support services? Participant, definitely. One of the biggest challenges was finding a safe place to go. She was worried that he would find her if she stayed with friends or family. So the shelter was really her only option. Also, there were times when she felt judged or blamed by others for staying in the relationship as long as she did. So we already coded access to shelter, and that what we could see here, that she accessed the shelter, and she was worried that he would find her if she stayed with friends or family. So there again, fear of retaliation if she got in touch with friends, and if she stays with friends, this person might attack her there. And then in the last line, there were times when she felt judged or blamed by others for staying in the relationship as long as she did. So maybe her friends were blaming her, why are you in this abusive relationship? So sort of being judged by the people around and blamed. So if you go up, there is this code which talks about stigma, social attitudes, people's perception around domestic violence, being judged. So that code applies here, stigma surrounding domestic violence. Interviewer, that's unfortunate. In your opinion, what do you think society can do better support women experiencing domestic violence? Participant, I think there needs to be more awareness and education about the signs of domestic violence and where to get help. Also, we need to work on reducing the stigma and shame associated with being a victim of abuse. It's not easy for women to come forward and ask for help when they feel like they will be judged or not taken seriously. So the first sentence talks about more awareness and education that needs to be done. And let's see, we got a code here. So awareness and educational levels, this code fits in there. So let's go back. Awareness and education. So that's another code. Stigma and shame associated with a victim. So that's another, we just coded. So let me put the code again. Stigma surrounding domestic violence. So we will stop here. The purpose was more sort of try to show you how does it look like in practice. So what you have noticed here is I'm using a predetermined coding framework which the researcher has already developed, and I'm using these codes to code the interview excerpt. So that's how protocol coding looks like in practice. If you got any questions, you can put your comments here and I will get back to you. Thank you very much and have a good rest of the day.